Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta and we are continuing our discussion on the yarn dyeing and fabric dyeing as part of this exploration on week 1 of this course. And here what we are doing is that we have already looked into how we differentiate between yarn dyed, fabric dyed as well as printed and painted fabrics. So, from there if we try to see some of these examples, perhaps I can start with the example of ikat making. So, in ikat making I have image of this dyed yarn in the upper left corner of the slide, and here what we can see is we have this yarns which are sort of like hanging from this loom, and what we can find them here is that how these yarns are resisted with threads and then they are dipped in the dye. So, it is not necessary that the yarn will be only dipped in one dye, but there can be variations within that as well, something that we can see in this bundle in which both red and blue is featured. Now, these dyes, those are used in particular this yarn that we have on screen, they are all aniline dyes, these are not natural dyes. But the thing is that we can see how this dyes are incorporated in terms of our understanding of resist, and then how those can be then featured into the ikat textiles that we have. Now, in the upper center side we see that how this yarns are then also sort of arranged to see that how this yarns would eventually be featured in the loom while weaving. So, even before that we see that there are the patterns, the graph for in which there are the patterns are created, and according to that the resist is made on these yarns. So, after the resisting and then dyeing of these yarns, they are again arranged to see that how those will be arranged in a loom for weaving, so that the patterns that they intend for can come out desirably. And then in the lower right corner we have an image, and that comes from the workshop of Ravender in Koyalagudam. All these images are taken in Koyalagudam. The upper two images are from the looms of Burra Viraya, and here what we have in the lower right image, we see how this double ikat weaving is continued. So, imagine that how this yarns that we see in the upper two images, they are set in this loom, they are arranged in this way, so that the colors can be sort of coordinated with one another. And then in double ikat we have already discussed this thing, that how particular colors they overlap with one another, so that these blocks of colors can be created. If the white, of course this weft that we have here, if this weft is something that is white, then the density of the color is compromised, and something that we also see in the single ikat. And when I say compromised, it does not diminish the merit of this kind of ikat weaving. It is just to say that how the density of the color that is achieved in the double ikat weaving is something that is distinctive from the single ikat. So, this is something we can find that in this way of making patterns on the textiles. So, if we consider this ikat textiles, something that we see in the lower right of this image, if this is something we can consider as a pattern fabric. So, how this pattern fabric can be distinguished from the painted and printed fabric is that in this case, for making these patterns we do not have any other tools except for the yarns which are used for resisting these threads. Whereas, in painted and printed fabric there are different kinds of tools which are used for making those patterns onto the textile surface. So, this is how we can see and distinguish how this yarn dyeing, fabric dyeing is something that is understood differently from painted and printed fabrics. So, to kind of again going back into this perhaps the distinction or the correlation between yarn dyed fabric and dyed fabric is something that is featured in these two historical examples. So, both these examples come from late 19th century, the Indian subcontinent. Now, the one that we have in the left side of the slide is a one that comes from Rajasthan, and it is a resist dyed or a bandhni fabric, in which we can imagine that the fabric was first dyed in Myrobalan or Haritaki or Harada, whatever one calls it. And then in this one, what happens is that there were those small areas which are sort of like, I mean, they appear as dots. They are all they are all resisted with yarn or threads, and then the entire piece, after creating these entire elaborate patterns on this fabric, those are then dipped into color, or those are dyed in color. So, in this case we see that, I mean, it is madder dyed primarily, and that is the reason it is red. So, the areas which are already resisted is something that still holds the color of Myrobalan, and that is the reason they are featured in yellow or like yellowish ochre, whereas the rest of the fabric had turned red. So, this is something we find, and the quality of it is coarse cotton, and then there are also little bit of like, I mean, very local and selective application of indigo is there in some of those resisted areas, which has probably been done at the end of the dyeing process. Now, this is something we find, it is a chadar or something which is wrapped in the body. It can also be used for wrapping in the head as a turban. So, this is one of the thing that we find, and this we can clearly see how the construction of the fabric is first done, and then upon the construction it is first dyed in Myrobalan, and Myrobalan is also used for increasing the tannin content in the cellulose based fabric, and then this is dyed in red or madder. So, we can see that, I mean, this is what we are talking about when we say dyed fabric, that the construction of the fabric is done and then it is subsequently dyed. Now, if we contrast that or see its correlation with the other fabric that we have on the right side of the screen, and this is a fabric, this is also called, it is also a chadar, which is presumably worn around the body. It is something that we wrap around the upper body, and this comes from Assam, again from late 19th century. And in this case what we see, this is called do suti chadar, and do suti chadar means that where we have two different kinds of threads which sort of like utilized for making this checkered pattern all over the body. And in this one we find that there is this ochre thread and slightly reddish kind of like, I mean, more sort of pinkish red thread. These two threads are utilized for making this fabric. Perhaps we can distinguish this red from the madder, this bright earthy madder dyed fabric in the left side of the screen. And as we know in Assam that lag dyeing is something that is much more sort of popularly practiced. We can imagine that, I mean, perhaps there are different kinds of dye stuff that is used in this do suti chadar if we compare it to this madder dyed fabric in the left. Now, what also happens here in this case, we see that in the border, this elaborate borders which are created here, elaborate in comparison to the one we see in the left. In this one we see at least 3 different kinds of threads. So, here we have white threads, there is this dark umber threads, and then there are also brown threads which are utilized, and all these 3 kinds of threads are then used only in the border, but not in the other parts of the body. And of course, it can be assumed how this dark umber and the white threads are something that is utilized as the web threads while making, and that is the reason we can also see the continuation of these threads in the border here, how one row of this border sort of continues to the other one, and that can be seen in the salvage of this fabric. Now, so here what we have is that how these yarns are perhaps, I mean not perhaps, I mean they are individually dyed. So, the red dyeing has been done separately from dyeing this ochre colored yarn, and then of course, the white yarns are perhaps undyed yarn, and then we also have the umber and brown colored yarns. So, there are 4 different dyes, at least we can see them to be incorporated. They are done separately, and it is not quite certain that whether they are done in the same workshop or not. So, those kind of information certainly we do not have access to. Now, all those different kinds of dyed yarns are then dried, collected, and then sort of made into this piece of fabric. So, certain kind of decision making takes place, either that can be a decision of the weavers, their collective knowledge, that can also be some of the decisions those are made by the communities who wear them. So, there are different kinds of significances of color, there are also issues about availability of certain kind of colors or materials. So, all of those things they define the way in which the final product is going to appear. So, in this case what we see that all these yarns are dyed separately, then they are all composed into this piece of fabric. So, now we can perhaps see the difference between how the dyed fabric and the yarn dyed fabric are there, and when we put them side by side, perhaps like I mean this some of these divisions can be much more prominent. So, the history of yarn dyeing and fabric dyeing, if we see them in the colonial documentation, and this is something we can explore them further in our discussion here. Now, the history of yarn dyeing and fabric dyeing is something, as I have already mentioned, that is there since the beginning of history, the human history. And the thing is that I mean why do I specifically want to continue with the discussion of the history of yarn and fabric dyeing in the colonial documentation, and that is also because that I mean what we see, that documentation of technique, certain kind of museumization of the actual objects. So, for example, the actual dye stuff that is used in dyeing, or certain objects and tools which are incorporated in the entire process are collected during this time. And then of course, we see the textiles are also collected during this time, and then drawings are made of this different kind of dye stuff, different kind of occupational groups, and so on. So, with all this we have different aspects of documentation, archiving, as well as knowledge generation, and all those things are around textile making in the Indian subcontinent, and that is something that makes me curious, or that intrigues me to sort of understand this multifaceted endeavors around the idea of yarn and fabric dyeing that took place during the colonial documentation. Now, this is when we see this thing, we are not trying to imply that the documentation of dyeing is not really been done in the Indian subcontinent, but perhaps when we look into some of the images that also elucidate this process of dyeing, we can look into this problem in a much more invested way. Now, let us look into the slide and try to understand that I mean how we are talking about this history of yarn dyeing, fabric dyeing in relation to the colonial documentation. So, in the left side of the slide we have an image of Oldenlandia ambulata, and this is also something that is known as Chaya roots, Siam, Chayvere, and so on, and this is something that is understood as one of the most potent dye stuff to produce this blood red and different shades of red that is featured in the Coromandel textiles, at least since the early modern period. This chaya roots were I mean of course, this not just the roots, but the plants are something that is found extensively in the Coromandel region, that is the southeast coastal region and the regions in southern India, also parts of the coastal Sri Lanka, in northern Sri Lanka mostly, and then also this is found in parts of Odisha and Bengal. So, this chaya roots is something that we find that how it held the promise of producing this brilliant red dyes, and something that we keep going on and on about. Now, we see this colonial obsession with chaya roots and its economic, perhaps like prospects, and that's the reason we find how people like William Roxborough and others, they have meticulously documented the plant, the root, different parts of the plant. They are all considered as part of this botanical studies of the plants and shrubs of the Indian subcontinent, but we cannot really ignore the aspects of their economic prospects. Now, during this time as well, we also see that how the actual these dried roots were collected by the colonial chroniclers, and then the travelers, the of course the officials, and then a lot of them were also sent to the different institutions. And when I say institutions, I primarily indicate the museums or the offices. So, for example, we do have that, after the 1850s, this exhibition, the 1851 exhibition in London, we see that how that subsequently sort of paved the way for making the Victoria Albert Museum, and initially the South Kensington Museum, and then there we find that it's not just the objects which were displayed, but then for supporting the objects we also see different kinds of dye stuff, different kinds of objects which are associated with making these textiles were also collected, and that is how we find that how these chaya roots were also collected, displayed, and this legacy continued. Now, the thing is that also we find that how this chaya roots and different kinds of dye stuffs are not only just collected in these museums, but also in the survey offices. Like, for example, today we have the Botanical Survey of India, and they hold a lot of this colonial documentations. And so, it is not just the documentative records of the written records, but also the objects themselves. So, we have the pictorial documentation of this objects, then we have the dried this objects, but then we will also have fabric pieces which are dyed with the same dye stuff. So, in other words, we find that this different ways in which one thing is sort of featured in the archival records, and that is something we find that this is very crucial, and this is also very distinctive in the colonial era, and that also makes us think about what is our relationship to different kind of community based practices as well as the institutional archives. And that is also something that makes me curious about the colonial era, and thus when we talk about the history of yarn and fabric dyeing, we focus specifically on the colonial documentation. Through this process, we also see that how certain kind of objects, when these are collected just like these objects, but then when we also see their documentation, for example, documentation in Roxborough's account, we see its economic prospect, something that the object cannot proclaim themselves. And then when we also have the dyed fabric with this dye stuff, then we see its result. So, in this ways we see that this juxtaposition of the actual and the representation of the same thing that also plays with its value system. So, again it is not really one object, just this object that we have in the right side of the screen. This roots cannot justify its value for visitors or people who will be encountering them for the first time, but then the value of it is always there in its relationship to the documentation that is produced, but also with the fabrics which are dyed with the same dye stuff. So, the value system of these objects in this documentation and how knowledge is generated is very relational, and that is something we can also see in the modes of this colonial documentation. So, history of different kind of textiles, history of different kind of dye stuff is also about how we value them today, and this kind of overlapping of different modes of collecting, which brings forth the questions about the actual objects and their visual representation, is something that is facilitated, that is enriched by this kind of discussions on value. So, that is also another reason why I wanted to sort of bring our focus to the colonial modes of documentation. Now, the other thing that we have here is the documentation of occupations, and it is something as we find that to be prominent in the colonial era from the 18th century onwards, and extensively in the 19th century. We see that how different occupational groups were represented in the visual documents and in the written records of the colonial officials, travelers, chroniclers, and so on. So, a lot of them, they have produced images pertaining to the textile making, because textile is something that was already, as we have explored in the earlier part of this course, that how textiles informed a lot of the trading activities in the Indian Ocean, and then textiles were also something that remained at the center of revenue generation for a longest period of time for the this East India companies, not just the British East India Company, but also the other Western European this companies who have been there in the Indian subcontinent. Now, for those reasons, we find that meticulous documentation and meticulous details are sort of presented when this documentation of these textiles are there. In the left side of the image that comes from perhaps from a mid 19th century workshop in somewhere in Eastern India or Northern India, perhaps this is a Patna painting, and here what we see that again there is this bamboo pole, and then there is a bar which is also, I mean, attached to this pole, and that sort of constitutes the basic setup for hanging fabrics or the dyed fabrics, because after dyeing they need to be dried, and of course, like the excessive color needs to sort of go out of the fabric, and this is the reason why we see this. I mean, this hanging of the fabric is facilitated in the dyer's workshop. And then what we see again almost at the in the center of this image, we have a dyer who is draped in white, but then deals with this brilliant red color. And here we have that how this sieving of or like, I mean, sort of getting these colors rid of the impurities is something that is going on in this process, and then the color that is sieved through this cotton sieve is something that is collected in a vessel down there. And then there are also this mortar and pestle in the foreground, and then there is another person who we find that, I mean, is involved in action, and perhaps this is an action in which we see that how the fabrics are put in this dye vat, and then they are dyed, and then the next process will be to, like, I mean, hang them on these bamboo poles. So, this is a documentation. It's even within this one frame we have different stages of this action being documented, and once we know the sequence of these actions, then all of these objects and these two people, whatever they are doing, they fall into place. Now, in the bamboo pole, we also have suggestion of this plain dyed fabric, which is in slightly pinkish red in color with one slight border at the end, which is presumably a sari or a similar sort that we have here, that is hanging. And then we also have a chadar or a dupatta, something that is wrapped in the upper body, that is prominently featured in the center of this image. Now, looking at the patterns, it can also be considered something that is similar to this piece of fabric here in the left side of the screen, that is perhaps a dyed fabric, a resist dyed fabric. Now, this one, as we see it, the one that is there in the right side of the screen, we find them to have almost a very similar kind of setup. So, it can also be considered that how one image perhaps also informed the making of similar kind of images across the northern Indian plain, and perhaps not just northern India, but elsewhere as well. And here we again see there is a dyer who is standing at this almost at the center of this image, and in the left side of the screen, if we have a dyer who has his upper body covered in cloth, and here we see a very quintessential depiction of dyer or other occupational groups with Indian men featuring being featured in only a loin cloth or a cloth that covers the lower part of their body. And then we also have another person who is there involved in dyeing fabric right beside the person who's sieving the color. So, in this cases what we have is a similar kind of setup again we see, and here instead of a bamboo, a bar that is like sort of connected to the poles, we see there is a kind of a string or a thread which is there for hanging these dyed fabrics. Here in the dyed fabrics, we do not really see much variation to understand that what kind of fabric might have been dyed, but then all of them are fabric and not yarn. That is something that is very clearly communicated in these images. These images, a lot of times these images are also taken for their evidential value, that how there are certain kind of this images which can be understood as a depiction of a dyer's workshop. But then if we compare one image with the other, we also find that how this kind of images can also have its own set pattern. For example, we have no evidence or no record of in what situation they are doing this process. To elaborate or to sort of demonstrate only the acts of dyeing and the people who are involved in this workshop, we see the background has been edited or sort of taken out of these images, and in that case what we also have the loss of contextuality. And if we compare that to perhaps how certain kind of objects which are involved in this images, we can also think that perhaps it is not clear whether the same dyer's workshop would also produce something like a resist dyed bandhni fabric, but then it can also have this aspect of accumulating and assimilating knowledge from different sources and putting them together in a set pattern of documentation that we have in this colonial images. So, with all this, we can see that how the circulation of knowledge about dyeing is something that had been there during the colonial era, and particular actions about dyeing, plain fabrics or yarn dyeing was popular during this time, and that is something that had featured in this documentations repeatedly in the 19th century. So, as I have mentioned that this is not the first time we see the process of dyeing or process of weaving that is visually documented or textually documented in India. In the Mughal miniatures, we do see a lot of references about making fabrics, and then also we have elaborate descriptions about fabrics and making of fabrics, differentiation between the finer and the coarser fabrics. However, we can see that how the characteristics here is very different. Here we have images of people as well as the objects, and all of them, they constitute the knowledge base for the colonial administrators. In the Mughal miniatures or in the earlier works where we see that either factual or poetic description of fabric making, yarn dyeing or dyeing has been featured, they are not to serve the administrators primarily for this economic gain, but there are many layered meanings which are involved in it. So, with that we will conclude the session about yarn dyeing and fabric dyeing. Now, we will look into some of the atrocities, the colonial atrocities around making dyes and dyeing in the subsequent sessions, and also look into how fabric dyeing and yarn dyeing had also reconfigured in the second half of the 20th century as a medium of artistic expressions. Thank you.